Heading overseas now, Barack Obama's historic trip to Cuba next month has drawn plenty of criticism from human rights groups who say it risks serving to legitimise a communist regime without securing any concessions on human rights. President Obama will become the first US president in nearly 90 years to visit the Latin American nation, which has been isolated by American policy for nearly 60 years. The presidential visit will come more than a year after the US and Cuba agreed to move towards normalising relations. Anne Barker reports.
The last time a US president visited Cuba was in 1928 when Calvin Coolidge arrived on a battleship. It was decades before the 1959 revolution that ousted the US-backed government in Havana and installed a communist regime that effectively still rules today. And while the US trade embargo remains unchanged after 56 years, President Obama is keen to normalise relations with Cuba in line with an agreement struck a year ago.
The president's judgment was that, number one, going to Cuba was an important step forward in signaling this new beginning between our two countries and peoples, and also importantly that going to Cuba could help enlarge this space that benefits the Cuban people and increases ties between our countries.
The US National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes says the two-day visit next month will be a major step towards reopening commercial ties between the two countries and advancing dialogue on issues such as human rights. Barack Obama has set conditions for the trip to ensure, as well as meeting the president, Raul Castro, he also wants to meet dissidents and ordinary Cubans.
He'll be meeting with dissidents, with members of civil society, including those who certainly oppose the Cuban government's policies, just as when he went to Panama for the Summit of the Americas and met with Raul Castro, he also met with critics of the Cuban government and his civil society roundtable. I think the point that we make to the Cuban government is that we engage civil society in countries around the world, that this is part of how the president does business. When he travels in different regions, he meets with a broad range of actors, and Cuba is no different.
Officials in Havana say President Obama is welcome to visit, but not to meddle in Cuban affairs. And a director from Cuba's foreign ministry, Josefina Vidal, has made clear Havana has a few demands of its own.
To achieve the normalization of relations between the two countries, the blockade has to be lifted and the territory occupied by the naval base in Guantanamo has to be returned.
But for any of that to happen, Barack Obama would need the support of the Republican majority Congress, which has so far defied moves to relax the trade embargo. The US has flagged the closure of Guantanamo Bay, but some in the US administration say that issue is not even on the table for next month's talks. Republican presidential candidate Marco Rubio, who's the son of a Cuban immigrant, says he'd love to see relations with Cuba change, but it can't be one-sided.
My problem with the changes towards Cuba is it asks nothing of the Cuban government. They are as repressive today as they've ever been. They're still putting people in jail. They're still rounding up dissidents. They're still beating people up in the street. They're still hosting intelligence listening stations for the Chinese and the Russians. The Cuban government still harbors fugitives of American justice. So I would love for there to be a change in the U.S.-Cuba relationship, but it has to be both sides changing. The Cuban government isn't changing, and so that's the wrong approach. And I don't care what the polls say. We're going to be about what's right.
One human rights group, Victims of Communism, says President Obama's visit is a mistake if there's no movement on human rights. Its head, Marion Smith, says in the year since the US and Havana agreed to move towards normalised relations, there's in fact been an increase in political prisoners in Cuba.
We have no reason to pretend that the Castro regime, which is supporting authoritarian regimes throughout Latin America, which continues to brutally suppress the freedoms of its own citizens, we have no reason to think that they're going to reform, and we have not used any leverage we had to get reciprocal reforms for, frankly, offering the Communist Party in Cuba great legitimacy.
For all the opposition to Barack Obama's visit, there is considerable support among ordinary Cubans.
This is very good news for relations between Cuba and the United States. It's time to upend those deep roots that the anti-communists have in Washington.
I get the impression that the visit will strengthen the relationship between the US and Cuba. That's what everyone wants.
After Cuba, President Obama will also visit Argentina.
Anne Barker